Good afternoon, colleagues. Thanks, Priscilla, for that introduction, and I hope that I'm not too provocative. Thank you for this opportunity to share my thoughts on academic responsibility and the scholarship of engagement. I advocate for the creation of a new kind of community engagement that generates a holistic partnership between university and society. Universities have a responsibility to find solutions to make society inclusive, peaceful, and sustainable. It is an epistemic responsibility of scholars to connect intellectual resources to civic and ethical challenges. The scholarship of engagement enriches students' educational experience, deepens authenticity of academic work, and spurs innovation in transdisciplinary research. The boundaries between the academy and community should be broken. Community engagement has a strong emancipatory element and should never be relegated to the fringe. Contributing to communities is critical for securing social change. The distortions introduced by apartheid continue to reproduce inequality and has led to a worsening of poverty. We note 4 poverty traps in the socioeconomic situation of communities that are responsible for their further pauperization. First, the high and rising levels of unemployment in a sluggish economy. Second, deeply institutionalized inequalities in the distribution of power, property, and opportunities between the elite and the poorest half of the population. And third, fragmented social structures and the syndrome of chronic community poverty. And lastly, the dynamics of violence, criminality, and ill health. Community engagement cannot and should not remain on the margins of the academic program. It should not be viewed patronizingly as a philanthropic mission, academics doing good when they feel charitable. The South African situation calls for a more rigorous community engagement. The experience of vertical violence during apartheid has extended to horizontal violence in disadvantaged communities, where the perceived weakest members of society are the targets of violence. For example, an average of 900 children are murdered in South Africa every year. The physical neglect of children is particularly significant as they are exposed to such negative influences that they may be unable to regain lost ground later in life, a factor that complicates early childhood education. The dynamics of crime, gender-based violence, gangsterism, drug abuse, and school violence are rooted in social deprivation. The litany of crimes of corruption of the new elite is catastrophic. The silence of the university gives consent to the new period of South African history, a post-Machiavellian moment when private accumulation happens through the appropriation of public resources meant for community development. The priority then for the intellectual is to reflect seriously on the ways academic practices either restrain or empower transformation of the increasing number of poor people. Engagement with local communities shifts higher education to a deeper concern with societal issues. Moreover, diverse partnerships with communities can nurture discovery, learning, and innovation so that higher education can become further entrenched within society. Unfortunately, given the fact that community engagement remains on the margin of academic work in much of our academic endeavors, it is not the intellectual production of communities that are foregrounded, but rather the interpretation of their experiences from a scholar's perspective. A shack dweller's response on the academic's reasoning on research into shack fires is poignant. They say, "We have heard many people suddenly become experts on shack fires. Some are saying the reasons that shack fires exist is because we build too close to one another. Others blame the forms of lighting that people use. In some cases, alcohol is said to be the cause of the fires. It is typical for academics to think in this way. They want to blame the oppressed for their suffering rather than to blame the system that caused oppression. This excerpt highlights the tension between the voice of the community and the voice of the scholar. We should include such tensions in our teaching program, given the continued resistance in communities. Research may reinforce marginalization if we do not engage with community as producers of knowledge. Question who speaks for whom. Interrogate whether the people can speak, or is it the scholar that needs to listen? Bell Hooks outlined this tension eloquently. There's no need to hear your voice when I can talk about you better than you can speak about yourself. No need to hear your voice. Only tell me about your pain. I want to know your story. And then I will tell it back to you in a new way. Tell it back to you in such a way that it has become mine, my own, rewriting you. I am still author, authority. I'm still colonizer, the speaking subject, and you are now at the center of my research. Colleagues, we should acknowledge that communities are neither silent nor in need of expertise to speak for them. They are engaged in the process of affirming their humanity as witnessed in persistent civil society uprisings. Although South Africa outweighs the likes of India, Russia, and China in its prevalence of protest, the academy has very little sustained and meaningful connection to community protests. Through our work, we too should focus on exposing injustice. However, we must foreground the voices of community struggles, or we risk perpetuating the very social inequalities that we hoped to challenge. Narratives of poor communities fail to engage with how the poor are organizing, the demands they are making, and how they are collectively confronting the system that degrades them. We should be cautious of producing a community without agency. There's valuable teaching collateral in community engagement, given the widespread dissatisfaction with many aspects of the post-1994 democratic dispensation. It includes schooling, university education, health, welfare, youth unemployment, housing justice, etc. The opportunities to engage with the communities at our doorstep are endless, and I would elaborate on 3 case studies. First, despite government promises of housing justice, by 2010, over 2 million families were evicted from their informal dwellings. The most recent wave of destruction of shacks in the Western Cape include those in Kleinmond, Zwelihle, Hermanus, Khayelitsha, Stellenbosch, Langa, and Delft. A continuation of dehumanization. There's also the dispossession of people in Salt River and Woodstock due to gentrification. The Cape Flats contain the poorest communities, is most densely settled, and has the highest portion of informal settlements compared to other areas of Cape Town. Theorists from the margins have long decried the way academic work is used to maintain marginalization. The solutions offered by scholars can be insidiously complicit in reinforcing structural inequality. The homeless people's movement declared ironically, always the solution is to educate the poor. When we get cholera, we must be educated about washing our hands, when in fact, we need clean water. When we get burnt, we must be educated about fire, when in fact, we need electricity. This is just a way of blaming the poor for their suffering. We want land and housing in the cities. We want to go to university. We want water and electricity. We don't want to be educated to be good at surviving poverty. Similarly, Cape Town activists in the Western Cape anti-eviction campaign highlight the role of the expert in delegitimizing the knowledge of communities, positioning poor people as ignorant and reinforcing systemic inequality. They say, stop workshopping us on world-renowned solutions at the expense of our homegrown knowledge. This means we refuse to be a stakeholder and have our voices managed and diminished by those who count. This paternalistic and do-good perspective of community engagement is poor scholarship. Scholars fail to acknowledge the resilience, courage, and strength of communities. And if we continue doing that, we could be charged with constituting an agency-less other in need of rescue. My second case study. As recent as October 2019, a multi-million rand United Kingdom research and innovative grant was awarded to Stirling University for research in informal settlements in the Cape Flats. The research team consists of academics from Stirling, UCT, UWC, and 2 white community workers. The lion's share of the funding goes to intervention work that conspicuously excludes civic organizations that currently engage with shack fires. It is evident that the anthropological process of knowing about the native is far from being disrupted. The important point of research into shack fires in the Cape Flats is the intellectual practice of speaking for the community, a practice that tends to maintain subalternization. A cadre of intellectuals have written about struggles of the poor without deeming it necessary to speak to communities or to attend their meetings or make any attempt to learn their language. This lack of respectful engagement is totally inappropriate. The third and most recent example is the unfortunate tension between academic research and injustice towards holders of traditional knowledge. There's been a historic struggle of the people of the Cederberg and Wuppertal to win recognition for the indigenous knowledge associated with rooibos tea and preserving a heritage that has earned the Khoi and San people global recognition. The community was exploited by global big business like Nestle, exploitation of traditional knowledge. The community has staked their claim to legal ownership of the traditional knowledge of their ancestors, and they've won. There are very few places in the world where such a claim has succeeded. After all they have achieved, they still do not own the land on which they grow the rooibos. In contrast to the community's struggle, we have rigorous scientific papers on rooibos, especially from the Western Cape universities, totally separate from the social context. The repertoire of research includes analysis of phenolic compounds in rooibos tea with a comparison of flavonoid-based compounds in natural populations of plants, safety assessments of phytochemicals derived from rooibos tea through interaction with CPY and PXR, chemical analysis and antioxidant activity of some rooibos tea products, etc., etc. What is missing is the intersectional racial and political history, the management of rooibos plants and of racialized bodies. Who has the right to be human? Who belongs to the landscape? And who is entitled to profit from the labor of communities? The lesson from Wuppertal and rooibos tea is that academics should integrate and interrogate the role they play in turning higher education into a marketable product. How the curriculum has subjugated the humanist agenda and our complicity in reinforcing the master narrative. The last part of my presentation advocates for epistemic responsibility. It is an enriching force in academic research, as it strongly foregrounds the impact of research on society. It would disrupt academic populism that churns out research output that has no social impact. The university should be more than knowledge factories satisfying the demands of business by producing foot soldiers for capitalism. A strong moral sense of epistemic responsibility would result in contribution towards useful knowledge. Sadly, many academics object to this, saying that it erodes academic freedom and autonomy. Very few of us question why we are so happy for public money to be spent on creating big profits for private industries. Some academics claim that it is not their responsibility to do impactful research or communicate their work beyond the academy. There's no category in the promotion criteria, in the NRF rating, etc., for the social impact of academic work. There's also the view that it is the duty of the public to educate themselves and benefit from the work of academics. Colleagues, our challenge then is to generate ideas to escape the grip of academic capitalism. Universities cannot be closed system, and academics should not be perceived to be isolated from society. The intellectual culture is becoming increasingly subservient to power, and intellectuals have a responsibility to seek truth and expose lies. Universities, especially those on the left, were originally the main force to intellectually critique the status quo, but their role became more subservient to political power, and journalists took over this radicalism. But now, the media is becoming more corporate, and journalists are becoming the sycophants. It is time for academia to become radical again. It is important to read academia and look at how epistemic responsibility is being structurally separated from our work. How it is NGOs like Equal Education that are friends of the court when children die in pit latrines, not educationists. How business curricula focus on shareholder dividends and profits without any consideration of worker rights and living wages that led to the Marikana massacre. Has the academic voice been captured? How do we regain the reputation of a university closely allied with community and social activism? How do we reconnect scholarship with communities? There's a need to better understand the positioning of universities and their role in reproducing as well as critiquing the social order. Academia itself reproduces and reflects back the inequalities of power found within capitalism, such that it produces a microcosm of capitalist activity in universities. This has undermined the collegial ideal, and research success has now been turned into a competitive sport. We were caught off guard with the student protest in 2016. In what ways have we enabled students, since fees must fall, to grasp the university and the, as the entirety of the social structure, to adopt a deeper perspective to education, and to respond critically to the community sphere? There is a need for universities to be and do more in response to broader public debates and establish stronger links with communities from which our students hail. Finally, Working to develop research collaboratively with communities requires participatory research designs. Engagement with research participants has to be shaped by respect and mutual benefit. This takes far more time than traditional ways of collecting data from communities. University research culture offers little incentive to building meaningful relationships with communities. We should work as collaborators, struggling in different ways, in different contexts, towards an egalitarian society where we learn together and from each other. It is important for researchers to situate themselves, not just in the product, but in the process of research, recognizing the history of communities they engage with. This would ensure a shift in power and view community as active partners in discovery and value their experiential knowledge. The exploitation of the intellectual property of communities is unethical. Our commitment should be towards a radical humanism that engages with the collective voices of communities. It is intellectual conceit to imagine that the ideas for progressive change can be produced only in the minds of intellectuals without dialogue with communities. This is also the challenge for non-authors, tasking intellectuals to overcome the colonial conditioning that views the dehumanized as people without agency. We should insist that scholars speak with rather than for communities, listening to and taking seriously the thinking that is done in communities requires shifting the geography of reason and challenging preconceived ideas of who does the thinking and where it is done. Thank you.